But one thing to remember is that shrinking any organization, whether it's private, whether it's public, is going to appear to be chaotic from the outside. And I don't think there's any way to do it that is not chaotic.
Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. On today's episode, Acton librarian Dan Huger speaks with Ryan Bourne, R. Evans Scharf Chair for the Public Understanding of Economics at the CATO Institute, as well as Alex Nowrasteh, Vice President for Economic and Social Policy Studies at the CATO Institute, about all things DOGE, or the Department of Government Efficiency. What does efficiency mean in the context of government? What has DOGE been doing? Is this chaotic as it has been portrayed? What are some useful models for understanding DOGE? And what has it done, and what will it do in the future? You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/actonline. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, Librarian and Research Associate at the Acton Institute. Today I'm joined by Ryan Bourne, R. Evans Scharf Chair of the Public Understanding of Economics at the CATO Institute, as well as by Alex Nowrasteh, Vice President of Economic and Social Policy Studies at the CATO Institute. Separately, they are accomplished thinkers across a broad spectrum of economics and public policy, but together they have been among the surest guides as to the potential for the new Department of Government Efficiency to downsize government, as well as its keenest observers as to just exactly what has it turned out to be, what has it actually done, and what might it do in the future. Their co-authored white paper, CATO Institute Report on the Department of Government Efficiency, How to Downsize and Reform the Federal Government, got me excited about its potential. And earlier this month, their essay, 6 Ways to Understand DOGE and Predicts Its Future Behavior, has made me more deeply understand its often chaotic early days. Ryan and Alex, welcome to Acton Line, and thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
Great to be with you.
So on the last day of February, the New York Times published a sort of first draft of DOGE's history under the headline, How Elon Musk Executed His Takeover of the Federal Bureaucracy. It begins with Musk dropping in on it by a fundraising dinner for then presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy in September of 2023. I'm going to quote from the beginning of that piece because it's just outstanding. As the night wore on, Mr. Musk held forth on a patio on a variety of topics, according to 4 people with knowledge of the conversation. His visit that week to the U.S.-Mexico border, the war in Ukraine, his frustrations with government regulations hindering his rocket company SpaceX, and Mr. Ramaswamy's highest priority, the dismantling of the federal bureaucracy. Mr. Musk made clear that he saw the gutting of that bureaucracy as primarily a technology challenge. He told the party of around 20 that when he overhauled Twitter, the social media company he bought in 2022 and later renamed X, the key was gaining access to the company's servers. Wouldn't it be great, Mr. Musk offered, if he could have access to the computers of the federal government? Just give him the passwords, he said jocularly, and he would make government fit and trim, end quote. Elon Musk went on to become an enthusiastic supporter of President Trump's campaign. And after his election, President Trump, a champion of Musk's vision for streamlining government. Elon Musk and the new Department of Government Efficiency have been making headlines ever since and have become lightning rods for critics of the administration, as well as rallying points for the administration's admirers. Now, Ryan and Alex, in your white paper, you begin to discuss with a discussion of the importance of DOGE's mission. people have talked about streamlining government for a long time in both parties. Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, who founded U.S. Digital Service, which was the rebrand for what DOGE became, have been interested in these ideas. Republicans, libertarian and conservative intellectuals have a long history of being interested in these questions. Why is it such an urgent question, this streamlining of government and restructuring government?
So I sort of want to begin with a slightly different version of that. But when people talk about efficiency and how the government operates, it's sort of a squishy term. It could mean a lot of different things. So Ryan and I are both trained as economists, and one way that is commonly thought of is the government achieves the goals that it sets out to achieve in the cheapest way possible, the simplest way possible, with the least amount of damage done. The way that Ryan and I think about it in our piece, and as we've written elsewhere, is that the government should do just a handful of things, supply some public goods, national defense, and a few other things, and it should do them as well as possible under limited resources. And the government, unfortunately, does way too much. And so real government efficiency, as we understand it, and as we lay out in our report, requires dramatically shrinking the size, scale, scope of the federal government, which is why, like in our report, we identify between about $2 and $2.5 trillion of spending cuts in there. But why is it so important now? There are several reasons. One, of course, is that the federal government often fails to deliver on its objectives, even when there are few and constitutionally enumerated legitimate functions, often weighed down by rules and regulations. The second is, of course, the enormous amount of government debt and the growth in deficits that are projected to continue as the entitlements near insolvency. And then a third, of course, is the how these combine to weigh down economic growth.
So all of this is about more efficiently delivering public goods from the public sector and unleashing the economic engine of productivity and growth in the broader economy to raise living standards. All of these things are related, and all of them are sort of deep structural problems in the United States government.
And that's right. And we don't want to make it easier or more efficient, for instance, for the government to enforce environmental rules.
Yeah.
Or to enforce labor market regulations, or to hand out welfare checks to people, right? That's not what we're talking about when we talk about efficiency. But you get the sense when you listen to other people commenting on this, that is sort of the mindset that they have going into it, right? So you listen to Ezra Klein, who's a very interesting fella, but you get the sense sometimes when he talks about efficiency, sometimes he means something different than what Ryan and I mean.
Yeah. So there's a question. He's very concerned with efficient delivery of services. The scope of those services is much broader for folks on the left in America in general, but he's not really concerned with these structural. I mean, he's got a new book out with Derek Thompson where he talks about some of those structural economic concerns. So he has those concerns too, but they're not driving a lot of the sort of left-wing criticisms of DOGE. What has been sort of, you laid out these concerns, Ryan. What has been the sort of the mix of the productive and unproductive in what's actually taken place since? How well has DOGE sort of addressed those concerns that you and Alex set forward in that early report?
Well, it was always going to be very difficult for DOGE in isolation to deal with, say, the problem of the national debt, because, of course, ultimately Congress has the power of the purse. So while I think Elon Musk, really spoke a big game about cutting public expenditure by 1 trillion, 2 trillion at one stage. That always looked far beyond the reach of an organization like this. That said, there are clearly inefficiencies, waste, fraud, and a whole raft of non-priority spending within the federal government. I think it's fair to say that the approach that DOGE has taken so far has kind of combined going after spending grants, agencies that conservatives have long detested and which are seen as kind of power centers of the left. I think some of those spending cuts, at least in the short term, will stick. And, telling the public that there's a lot of this wasteful, silly spending that doesn't reflect their priorities could arguably help, generally change the public ethos towards government activity in a way that in future may help allow more substantive spending cuts. So that's kind of like the positives of what we're seeing so far. The negatives, of course, is that the way that they've kind of gone about it, in part because of the inherent limits on what they're able to do, has been, in some cases, they've kind of been quite broad in where they've been making cuts or enforcing layoffs within the federal bureaucracy. And inevitably, when you do that on quite a kind of scattergun approach, you're going to end up laying off some people that actually do things that are productive in the sense of enabling private sector activity. So, if you lay off a lot of people who are doing energy permits, for example, and all of a sudden people who want to explore new energy sources are unable to get the permits to actually get to work and get drilling, that doesn't just undermine one of President Trump's other ambitions, which is drill, baby, drill. It actually undermines economic efficiency writ large. So there's a whole lot to unpack about the way that DOGE has gone about this. I'm sure the rest of this conversation will dig into it. But that, to me, seems like the fundamental tension at the moment. On the positive side, we've seen some restraint of certain grants and non-priority spending and a marketing campaign that says, government does lots that I think most of the general public would disagree with. But on the negative side, the approach that they've taken that has been quite broad can sometimes mean you get these kind of false economies that lead to spending cuts or layoffs, which can do short-term damage.
Yeah, one of the things, my expectations for this when it started was that this sounded sort of like one of those innocuous sort of blue ribbon commissions that many administrations have dedicated towards basically just doing that sort of PR work around the issue. But that's not what we've seen. What we've seen is an actual, while it hasn't been able to tackle structural deficits for all of the reasons that you mentioned in terms of acting independently of Congress, it has been able to sort of just stop payments on things and move very fast. This strikes me as it's very similar to when Elon Musk took ownership of Twitter. He laid off an immense amount of personnel there. It was a company that was bleeding a lot of money when he purchased it, and he brought it into a more sustainable position. A lot of people were very scared. A lot of people thought their favorite website would stop working when he did that. And as many problems as Twitter does have, it still works. It still does essentially what folks log onto it to do. Alex, what do you make of this particular approach in terms of, there are constitutional questions around it, but there's also just sort of a question of, how similar are business and government? How readily should we look at models in the business world and be like, this seems to have worked at a place like Twitter. Why can't it work for the federal government? Why might we expect that to be different, or why might we expect it to work in a similar manner?
So there's a few differences between the business and government worlds and how they operate. So one big one is that cost cutting by cutting personnel works much better in the private sector, where, for instance, like private firms, like professional service firms, payroll costs are often more than 40% of revenue. In the federal government, compensation for employees, other than like postal employees, is only about 8% of revenue. Most of what the government does is it takes in tax revenue from some people and gives it to other people through Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, things like that, which are activities that are just not that labor intensive. They're done by computers, they're done automatically in a lot of cases, right? So if you go in and zero out just hypothetically the federal workforce, that doesn't even come close to closing a deficit. That comes to somewhere around $400 to $500 billion, and the deficits are about $2 trillion, right? So even if you have that extreme outcome, it's not going to close it. That's not to say that we shouldn't fire a large number of government employees. I want to fire a large number of government employees, and many of the individuals who have been let go from DOGE, almost all of them are people that I would agree with, right? Without substantial regulatory reforms that, say, eliminate the need for permitting, these are the types of things to cut. But one of the problems with government in general, and why I am attracted to libertarianism and sort of radical free markets, is that there is not an immediate feedback mechanism. And when the government makes a mistake, to correct their behavior, in the way that when firms make errors, they see it affect their revenues, they see it affect their profits, and there is an incentive because there's a residual claimant. There is an owner who has an incentive to make sure that the firm is profitable and to do the best that he can to adapt to changing circumstances. That doesn't exist in the government, right? So the way that DOGE and Musk operate is, Musk has this phrase, that his sort of rule of thumb, which is if you're not adding things back in at least 10% of the time, you're just not cutting enough. But the thing is that requires a feedback mechanism, right? You're on a manufacturing line, you take out a certain process and the car doesn't work. You know that pretty quickly. You take out some government employees and, you might find out pretty soon that, hey, nobody knows how to run the nuclear weapons. Yeah, which they had to hire back some people who manage nuclear weapons at the Department of Energy after they fired them. You might find out that you're not issuing enough oil permits. It might take a little longer to figure that out. There's not that feedback mechanism that's effective. So, we all have grown up, I think, hearing people say the government needs to run like a business, but they are such radically different types of organization that it would be difficult to do so. Yeah, Ryan, you have something to chime in here.
Yeah, so just a couple of thoughts. So one is that one advantage of this approach is that even if there are some diseconomies, even if it doesn't save a lot of money, I think there may be an aim here to try and change the culture of employment by the federal government, right? So if you lay off a bunch of workers, if you show that certain things that are non-priorities like DEI aren't going to be tolerated within this administration, even if Republicans lose the next election, right, that becomes a lot more of an uncertain career path for many people, and you might just get a different type of person apply to work in the federal government. So you can still see that there might be potential kind of long-term benefits of doing this, even if it doesn't save a lot of money. On the feedback loop stuff, there of course is a feedback loop, but it's much kind of slower working, which is the political process. As Alex said, if Musk tried to make some efficiency saving in the production of one of his rockets, say, and then the rocket blows up and doesn't make it into space, he's still in charge. He's still in power to then make that change. Go back on the previous deletion and kind of go again. The concern from a kind of libertarian perspective about this is that if you lay off certain people and certain government services that people are dependent upon get noticeably worse, and you're not able to replace the employees with AI or hiring different people or whatever, and there's just these inefficiencies that manifest themselves, people not answering the phones for Social Security queries and things like that, that the feedback will be Republicans losing dramatically in the midterm elections, and then effectively the second half of Donald Trump's presidency becoming a complete lame duck, in which case much less powerful than before. So you can envisage a scenario where you go about doing a lot of this restructuring, you lose political power, and then a lot of that stuff is undone quite quickly. A lot of your agenda is held up by Congress, but then the next presidential election, a lot of this stuff is undone quite quickly. So, potential long-term benefits in terms of cultural change, but I do share some of the concerns that Alex has.
And then, you asked about the Constitution, of course.
Yeah.
We can't shove that aside. And Ryan and I, thankfully, neither of us are attorneys, thank God. But we do have a fairly good understanding, I think, of the Constitution. What's going on here is, you have a lot of agencies that there was no enumerated power that gave Congress the power to create these agencies in the first place. USAID, Health and Human Services, the Department of Education, the Department of Energy. I mean, there's no clear enumerated power for any of those activities. So you have this sort of philosophical quandary, which is, how do you unwind or eliminate government agencies that are unconstitutional in the first place? Does the president have the ability to empower people to do that if he in good faith thinks that these agencies are unconstitutional? And that's a hard question, I think, to answer. There are certainly legal concerns with some of the actions that DOGE has taken, and those are important to address. We're ultimately all rule of law people. We don't want the temperaments of certain men to be in charge, or women to be in charge. But we also realize that this is a great opportunity. DOGE is a wonderful opportunity to roll back some very egregious extensions of state power into our lives that have no constitutional basis. We want the rules to be sorted out. We want the laws to be sorted out consistent with the Constitution. But it's quite a quandary to be in.
Yeah, and Ryan, you had something to add on the constitutional question.
Yeah, there are definitely legal issues and constitutional questions here. I think they broadly can be put into three different buckets. We've been discussing this internally with CATO. There's the empowerment stuff, and does the president have the power to just cancel spending that he thinks is unnecessary given the aims that Congress has put forth in legislation? And I think, there are big libertarian principled concerns about the power of empowerment, and clearly the Trump administration thinks the Empowerment Control Act is unconstitutional, wants the executive had to have much more power to cancel spending. But that throws up a lot of problems. You could imagine a world in future in which Congress is, expected to vote on a very important bill that the president wants passed. Mm-hmm. He uses the threat of impounding certain spending to try and convince certain members to vote his way for the bill. So, there are the big problems with impoundment. And I think the generally accepted view after the Nixon administration is that, you're probably not going to get far in suggesting that empowerment is constitutional. But, perhaps DOGE is a test case for that. The second issue is over the structure of DOGE itself and whether, Elon Musk is and others, are acting as officers of the executive and should be bound by more restrictions on what they're able to do. There are definitely issues there, but, in the grand scheme of things, there have often been czars and, the US Digital Service had some of these powers already. It's not clear to me that there's an inherent libertarian principle. And finally, there's the powers over kind of laying off workers, changing civil service protections. How much can the executive actually control the federal bureaucracy? And I think most libertarians subscribe to a kind of much softer version of the unified executive theory, where they think, well, the president as an administrator should be able to control some of these things, perhaps more than they currently do. So of those three constitutional buckets, I think we should be much more concerned about empowerment than the other two. But I think all three raise kind of issues that are no doubt going to be thrashed out in the courts. Yeah.
Now, early on, in the conception of this, one of the things looking back on the history of it is it's interesting that Musk's first sort of semi-public musings on this sort of role were at the Vivek Ramaswamy fundraiser, not at a Donald Trump fundraiser. And Vivek Ramaswamy was, of course, involved in the early stages of DOGE when they first talked about forming DOGE as a commission. He was going to be co-commissioner with Elon Musk. That did not happen for all sorts of reasons that the historians will fill us in on later. But one of the animating concerns was they had sort of different visions for what this sort of reform should look like. And my impression was always that Vivek Ramaswamy was much more interested in regulatory reform in a sort of growth-oriented posture rather than a strike at the bureaucracy for a more personnel focus. And Ryan's brought up some very interesting things about, culture influences a lot on how organizations work, and personnel influence a lot on how the organizations work. But what have you both seen in terms of, because this was another large part of your report was that, regulatory reform could be a part of this. What have you seen so far on that front? And has it been encouraging, or could they be doing more?
Well, certainly Vivek Ramaswamy kind of being dismissed before DOGE actually, came into being, very much suggested, and the reporting at the time very much suggested that Elon Musk was much more concerned about federal spending than the regulatory state. Mm-hmm. And I think most of the early actions are kind of chime with that thesis. There has been a more recent executive order which has kind of linked DOGE to try to empower agencies to kind of list out current regulations which they believe they're not bound to kind of enforce by statute and things. So it does seem as if they're at some stage they're going to get round to doing a kind of regulatory audit. But certainly from all of the kind of external marketing, it's not clear that they see that as their central mission. And I think, I think I'm kind of right in saying that I think that we very much see DOGE now as about personnel management, trimming government spending, particularly on procurement, grants, trying to shutter certain agencies, rather than regulation being kind of front and center of what they're trying to do. Maybe that will change in time. Maybe they're going through these more systematically, but certainly the impression that I get is that the regulatory stuff is kind of an add-on rather than a central feature of their mission. That's right.
And I think one of the reasons why it's an add-on and Vivek's approach has been, diminished somewhat in DOGE is there already are legal avenues for agencies through, notice and comment and rulemaking to reduce the burden of regulations. It's already a legal process to do that. And Trump did some of that in his first term, not as much as we want, of course. And they're pursuing that now in other areas. I mean, one of the some of the big ones was there were a large number of executive orders revoked by Trump early on in his administration and subsequent ones. Executive orders issued by his predecessors going back to the 1960s in some cases. Overwhelmingly positive from our perspective, but that power already exists. What DOGE is at least becoming is much more of a focus on the nitty-gritty of personnel, mm-hmm. Civil service reform, of contract and procurement reform, and trying to roll back a lot of those excesses. I think with a particular focus on those that are very progressive coded.
Yes.
Which is why I don't think it was a mistake that USAID and some of the issues of the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Education are some of the first targets of DOGE, right? 3 agencies that, due to COVID, due to opposition to federal education bureaucrats, and due to the perception, the accurate perception, by the way, that USAID supports a lot of progressive international nonprofits. So I think that fits in very well more to that rather than a broad-based regulatory reform. Now, there have been some executive orders by Trump that sort of empower DOGE to take a look at these. No doubt they are, but there's already a legal process, and there are already personnel in place at a lot of these agencies who are undertaking this. Of course, one of the funny thing to think about is when DOGE sort of comes in conflict with this sometimes. So some of the permitting folks who were fired by accident in the Bureau of Land Management, Department of Interior, on this, were people gearing up to write regulations to revoke previous regulations.
Yeah.
And they reversed that very rapidly, right? But that's part of the learning process for this. But there already are activities that the government undertakes to try to roll back these regulations.
So, I mean, you're very right to point out the departments that have been concentrated on, and also some of the first initiatives were specifically targeting sort of federal DEI, race, ethnicity data, gender, sexuality things in these departments. And in fact, a lot of just removal of this sort of stuff from websites, this sort of language. What do we make? So there's the culture of hiring and firing, but when particularly conservatives critique HR culture these days, it's actually those things that are front and center as the DEI, the gender and sexuality stuff. That was sort of the first big headlines out of this, and maybe this is just partially where folks on the left were sort of most initially invested, and it's also very transparent when language starts to get removed from government websites. That's something that's easy to check. That's something that's highly visible. What do you make of those sorts of reforms? And is that an effort? As Ryan said, is that an effort to sort of change the pool of potential applicants for positions in the federal bureaucracy? This was an environment that was very friendly to those sorts of DEI, gender and sexuality concerns. That was very much a part of the federal workplace work environment in the Biden administration, and the Trump administration has been very hostile to those things now. How do you see that working out? Yeah, Alex.
So I think there are two ways to view this. The first, of course, is ideological. For several years now, conservatives, the Republican Party have rightly been disgusted by DEI initiatives and this sort of just the ideological push for these types of things. So that's one part of the target, and then the other is a meritocracy element to it. So Silicon Valley, where a lot of DOGE employees are from, and where Musk sort of grew up, is a very highly meritocratic-oriented industry. And they look at federal rules on things like affirmative action, on DEI, on other types of things as being anti-meritocratic, and they're right. They are, which is why some of the first, or it was about a week or so after the election, Donald Trump revoked the executive orders from the 1960s from Presidents Johnson and Nixon that created federal affirmative action in hiring and contracting, basically unwinding that whole apparatus. Extremely positive developments there. And so this is a way to increase the, to try to reduce the, DOGE tries to reduce the quantity of federal employees, but through these types of initiatives to also increase their quality.
Yeah, the other thing that we haven't touched on that your report goes into quite deeply is actually efforts of sort of, we've talked a little bit about contracting and how some of these reforms have handled contracting, but there's also, a question of how much have we seen privatization be something that DOGE has really seized upon as a tool to maybe realize some of these goals? Or do you think that's something that's been sort of underexplored thus far within the Department of Government Efficiency?
I don't think it's been front and center of the Department of Government Efficiency. I think that there is an aim within the Trump administration for a limited range of privatizations. I think certainly we've seen discussion, not related to DOGE, but more broadly about freeing up certain federal lands in the West, selling off certain federal lands for both business development, housing. So that's, a form of privatization of a state-held asset. But by all accounts, there have been some changes to kind of collective bargaining rules of, employees in airports and things that suggest that maybe there's a route to kind of privatizing certain aspects of air travel, air traffic control. So I think some of these things are ticking over, but I don't think that they're a central feature of what DOGE is trying to achieve. And I think this is something that would probably happen within the Trump administration, irrespective of whether DOGE existed or not. This is something that Trump's administration was interested in during his first term. Certain problems have obviously manifested themselves in greater ways since then, not least some of the housing problems, particularly out west. So, I think this is just a natural progression of what the first Trump administration tried to do, as opposed to something new that DOGE has brought to the table.
Yeah. Now, as we've looked at sort of what DOGE has done, it's done a lot of different things in a lot of different areas. And the essay that you published in the middle of earlier this month that you co-published looks at sort of 6 different models of thinking about what DOGE is, given what they've done and what they've promised to do. What was your thinking behind? I found this extremely fruitful way to think about this, is to think about this in terms of models, because it has been a little haphazard and chaotic, and media coverage has been sort of all over the place with it. When you were considering, when you were first coming up with this essay, what struck you as particularly fruitful about the models framework in general, about how to, as folks who work in public policy, who as people who analyze all sort of government initiatives, programs, what's fruitful in that model's way of thinking?
So the main reason why models are useful is it forces you to simplify how the real world works, but to focus on the essential elements and variables that guide behavior and allow you to hopefully make predictions about what's going to happen, right? So like the most famous canonical economics model, of course, is supply and demand, allows you to make some, it's an excellent model, allows you to make some predictions. So, and there are models in every aspect of social science that allow people to try to make some predictions. Now, they require, of course, assumptions about what's going on. And we took a look at some of the evidence to weigh the assumptions that go in to each of these models. But like you said, the perception is that DOGE is behaving chaotically.
Yeah.
And there's this sort of implicit models that I think everybody has when they try to explain what's going on. And so we thought it was fruitful to write down what many of these were explicitly, to give some guidance both to ourselves, but just to the world to be able to understand it.
Yeah. And I think going through a couple of these would be helpful to give listeners an idea. We'll post, of course, links to both the earlier report we were discussing and into this essay on models in the show notes, along with that New York Times story with some of the great back history of this. Your first suggested one is that DOGE is seeking to purge progressive influence from within the federal government. And Ryan, we talked about this earlier. This is DOGE as a way of practicing a culture war, or particularly a workplace culture war, when the workplace is the federal government. Is this a model you see? This is a model that I actually see a lot between a lot of sort of mainstream reporting on DOGE, as you see a lot of journalists take this angle where they examine this as a way to sort of punish progressives. You see this in a lot of coverage of, now this isn't DOGE, but like what's going on in the Kennedy Center is a sort of a model for this. How much does what things does this explain? Does it do a really good job of explaining, and what things does it do less of a job explaining?
Yeah, so one of the reasons that we took this model-based approach is because I think many of a kind of left-wing ideological persuasion fundamentally just see DOGE as kind of evil and some combination of evil and incompetent. And I don't think that's, you have to have a more structured approach for trying to understand what they're doing, and clearly there's more to it than that. So as you say, the first kind of model we have is DOGE as a progressive purge mechanism, and this is a more ideological schema, the idea that DOGE at least prioritized firing left-leaning personnel, people hired in the Biden era who were on probation, defunding NGOs, dismantling DEI programs, targeting those progressive coded agencies and departments like USAID, the Department of Education, and as we talked about earlier, DEI related kind of internal federal bureaucracies. So clearly there's like a lot of evidence to suggest that this was part of at least the prioritization of what they went after first. There is some evidence, I think, that what they're trying to achieve goes quite a long way beyond this. Since then, they've gone after a lot of federal management consultant contracts and stuff that go way beyond these areas. They did include cuts to things like the Bureau of Industry and Security, kind of export control related things, which are essential for semiconductor export controls. That's a Trump priority, but they still tried to cut back that bureaucracy. And just one final point on this, there's an interesting tension. You have to remember the Trump administration is a coalition.
Yes.
There's an interesting tension between the kind of more libertarian instincts of some of the tech bros who are associated with DOGE, who might want to just zero out certain spending, and some of the more national conservatives that, think maybe we should take over the federal bureaucracy and use it for conservative, cultural, economic ends. And one of the things related to that is actually what's going on with arts funding. So you might imagine that conservatives would have seen the National Endowment for the Arts and the Kennedy Center and just thought, well, why don't we privatize the Kennedy Center and just scrap all arts funding? This all flows to progressive ideas. Let's get rid of it. But actually, no. The NEA has kind of restructured its grants away from underserved communities to more patriotic themes of celebrating the 250th impending anniversary of the United States. Trump has appointed himself to the Kennedy Center board to try and make it more open to conservative performers and things. One of the stated things that he has said. So there are still these tensions, but I think there's quite good evidence that at least in the prioritization, Musk and DOGE went after progressive coded activity within the federal government first.
Yeah. The second model that Alex and I talked a lot about earlier was, the idea of this is an application of Musk's style of corporate restructuring to government. And this is one of those things that you've seen parts of that national conservative coalition be very angry at Musk. Sohrab Ahmari is one of these folks. Patrick Deneen is someone else. Sort of, why are we dismantling these bureaucracies instead of filling them up with our people? But so we've talked a lot about what's productive, what's unproductive about those business models. But as a means of rallying public support, which is the third model you discuss in your essay. I think how Elon Musk has used Twitter, his own personal Twitter account, along with his duties within the government, to sort of single out these extravagant lines of spending or these or frankly just strange things. Sometimes those tweets are more truthful than other times. Oftentimes they are exaggerated, if not wrong. But it does clearly seem that he thinks that part of the job is highlighting these things, of building a sort of public case. What do you make of those sort of efforts as the DOGE is a sort of propaganda ministry model?
So I think it makes a lot of sense, and it's consistent with what some other prominent government employees under Trump have said. So Russ Vought, who is head of the OMB, has just this sort of marvelous quote where he sort of fills out his philosophy of convincing the public on how to cut large amount of government spending, right? And he says, when families decide to get on a budget, they don't try to renegotiate their mortgage first. What they try to do is cut out, the small things in their life that is not necessary, right? So they take fewer vacations. They don't go to the movies as much. They don't eat out as much. And then after they've cut those types of activities back, they start to take a look at the big immovable spending items, things like their mortgage, cars, retirement accounts, things like that. And so his point is that the American public are just not going to be supportive of major entitlement reform changes to welfare spending, changes to defense spending, until they are convinced that the government has done everything it possibly can to stop funding like Bob Dylan statues in Mozambique, as he puts it, or gay pride parades in Prague. So I see some of what DOGE is doing is definitely consistent with that model of trying to convince the public that we need to cut government spending, and we're doing everything we can on the sort of silly, unserious stuff first. And then if that's not enough, we're going to come back and say we need to do more on entitlements, welfare, defense, and other big ticket items.
Yeah. Yeah, Ryan.
Yeah, of course, that's it's kind of a risky strategy politically. There's an internal logic to it, but you can imagine a world where you pivot in a few years and say, okay, now we've rooted out certain things, we're going to turn to entitlement reform. And a lot of the public just remember all of the wasteful government spending and think, unless you've absolutely zeroed it all out, and the public doesn't think often in these magnitudes, can't compare the trillions associated with entitlements with some of the tens of millions, hundreds of millions, and even thousands associated with some of these grants, and say, well, no, why are you cutting my Social Security when we're still funding those LGBTQ comics to Peru and things like that? So there's kind of a risk that, going down this route, that unless you can really prove that you've been affected in rooting out all waste, abuse, fraud, non-priority spending, that actually you implant these ideas even more deeply in the public psyche, and it becomes more difficult to do on entitlement reform in future.
Yeah, that's the sort of dark side of this, and you've got another sort of dark model. The fifth model he discusses that DOGE provides political cover for Congress to be even more fiscally irresponsible. It is very easy to stop sending grantees checks and to just zero those out in software within executive departments. It is much harder to get elected politicians to actually do their jobs on Capitol Hill. Unpack this. How does this sort of thing provide political space for Congress to be even more politically negligent than it already is?
So right now, Congress is, they recently passed the House of Budget Resolution calling for about $4.5 trillion in extended tax cuts, plus $300 billion in new spending over the next decade, balanced out by about $2 trillion in offsetting spending cuts. And the idea is that they will just be less serious in taking deficits as the problem they are that they need to close, because they can just say, well, DOGE is here, DOGE is going to do it.
Yeah.
We'll rely on DOGE to cut this spending. DOGE is huge and prominent in the news. Elon Musk is a really smart guy. He knows what he's doing. we'll rely on him to fix all these problems with waste, fraud, and abuse to balance the budget, right? Sort of a combination of innumeracy, but also just shirking their political responsibilities to balance the budget. And I think, as we all know, watching members of Congress dealing with budgets over the decades, I mean, they will use any opportunity to avoid any kind of cut that they possibly can. And so it's totally not outside the realm of possibility that they do this. And indeed, when you talk to a lot of budget experts in Washington, D.C., people who are free market, who are conservative, who are sometimes libertarian, who are just very much want to shrink government spending or are worried about deficits, this is often what they come to when a lot of them do not take DOGE that seriously and aren't big supporters of it, because they understand like there needs to be systemic reforms to balance the budget in the long term and get our fiscal house in order. They see DOGE as a distraction at best from that, and at worst they see it as a way for Congress to free ride and not rein in spending. And this, I think, gets back to the earlier points we were talking about. The big changes that we'd all like to see and shrinking the size scale, the scope of the federal government will eventually require Congress to pass laws to do this, right? And DOGE, they might view DOGE as sort of this half measure that's not going to be effective and may even be bad by allowing Congress to, basically free ride off of them.
Yeah, Ryan.
Yeah, there's a kind of Model 5B to this that I'm just kind of spitballing with here. And
yeah,
so there's a model that doesn't necessarily explain DOGE's actions, but a version of this where we end up in a world where there's been such media coverage about these savage cuts without putting them in a broader context of the broader federal budget. To cut overall spending by $1 billion this year because of the way Social Security and Medicare and interest on the debt is going up, you actually have to cut from the baseline about $275, $280 billion. So what DOGE is doing is being written about and talked about as if these are really savage, mass layoffs. And so one could imagine in future a risk that the public gets perception that we've tried this awful austerity, kind of European 2010 style austerity, while actually the budget is still blowing up. And that creates a dynamic where the next Republican administration or the next Democrat administration says, we don't want to go down that route again. We tried the savage cuts, and if something came about, if we had a recession or something, and that gets attributed to the actions of DOGE, then this could set off an even more dangerous, fiscally irresponsible dynamic. So, the version that we have in the essay is about DOGE giving congressional Republicans cover today to perhaps do less on the budget than we'd hope. But there's also a model of this where DOGE gives future Congresses more space to be fiscally irresponsible because these cuts, small in scale, are seen as a failure or perhaps driving some bad economic outcome.
Yeah. I mean, all of these models are very fruitful to think through, and they give you different perspectives, and they allow you to sort of, read the headlines in a more discerning way. At the end of the day, though, all of these are simplifications, and we learn a little bit from each of them. As very savvy folks who have watched this process from the beginning and who have thought very deeply about this, at the end of the day, how do you think things are going with DOGE? Do you think that, you obviously think that you've both acknowledged, that there are good things that have happened, there are bad things that have happened. This is potentially a sign of good things to come. There's other ways in which it's potentially a sign of bad things to come. On net, as of today, here in March 2025, where do we stand in the balance? Ryan.
So before we answer that, I think it's just worth saying that these models are not mutually exclusive. In fact, some of them can kind of be self-reinforcing. So, the way that combining various aspects of the models, the way that I primarily think about this is that, Elon Musk has a certain way that he thinks works in turning an organization around. But naturally, he's working alongside more ideological conservatives who would want him to prioritize and want DOGE to prioritize going after some of the progressive beachheads within the government. And naturally, because you want to get buy-in, you advertise the most egregious, wasteful, non-priority spending. And so you kind of, it's natural, I think, you have political incentives to run that type of marketing campaign. It's also natural from a human perspective that you're probably not going to prioritize so much laying off workers, cutting programs that are to your own personal or your company's personal benefit. So, some of these things kind of combine, I think, to explain some of the actions and the prioritizations that we've seen. Some of them are, of course, more speculative and about, how this changes the political dynamics or, how this might empower, say, congressional Republicans. But I think there's a way of marrying some of these threads together that explains some of what DOGE, the vast bulk of what DOGE has been doing so far. In terms of like where I see it, I think that DOGE tried to hit the ground running, tried to go about defanging or in essence shuttering a whole range of federal agencies, had quite a good approach of trying to put all of the receipts for what it was doing and what grants and things it was cutting on its website, wanted transparency. But a lot of these people that are doing this aren't inherently experts in government. I think they got a lot of blowback. I think they recognized that some of the cuts they were making were false economies and they've had to reverse. I think they recognized that there were lots of errors and overestimations of savings in their kind of wall of receipts. And so the instinct that I have is that they're doing a lot of this stuff more quietly now than they were before. I know from talking to various people that they're going through a whole range of different consultancy contracts, management consultancy, change management kind of contracts. They're reviewing a whole range of federal IT systems, trying to clean things up. So I think after all of the kind of glitz and glamour of the first 3-4 weeks, they're doing some of the unsexy kind of back office work at the moment, and perhaps recognize that in those areas they can have some real value added in the immediate term. Now, how that plays out in the longer term, I think remains to be seen. I think Elon Musk clearly has ambitions to reduce larger amounts of spending than just fiddling with federal personnel. But, if he's going to achieve that, at some stage he's going to need buy-in from Congress. And even though there have been 1 or 2 politicians that have offered to, codify some of this in either a rescissions bill or executive restructuring bill or something else, at the moment that's not forthcoming. And it, perhaps in 6-7 months, where Musk is thinking about the legacy of DOGE because it's time limited till July next year, we'll see more pressure, and he might bring more pressure on politicians to try to codify some of this. So that's kind of broadly where I see it, but maybe Alex has a slightly different view.
So I see it broadly. I see it broadly positive. I think that every cut that I've seen, with the exception of the handful of personnel here or there who approve permits, I approve of. I think the big area of blowback is often from the perceptions of chaos that these cuts cause. And, the errors that DOGE made originally, the sort of haphazard approach and the coverage of it certainly multiplied the perceptions of that chaos. But one thing to remember is that shrinking any organization, whether it's private, whether it's public, is going to appear to be chaotic from the outside. And I don't think there's any way to do it that is not chaotic. Now, perhaps they could have done some things a little differently to make that appear less chaotic. Maybe they could have been a little better prepared. Maybe they could have hired more experts who understand how the government functions to make it a little more sort of orderly shrinkage. But ultimately, that doesn't concern me nearly as much. One of the sort of theories that we didn't put in there that sort of encompasses pretty much all of these to different degrees is that you could really call it the Department of Government Control. In the sense that the perception of the first Trump administration was that they didn't have power over the administrative state as much as they wanted. So they couldn't make it do the things that they wanted it to do. And this is a heck of a way to come in quickly to make a lot of positive changes from our perspective, but to assert control and to say, we're in charge. We're going to make changes. You're going to actually listen this time, because if not, your functions, your jobs, etc., are all on the line. And that's for good and for bad. I think there are all elements of what Trump wants to do where we agree with, and elements where we disagree with in total when it comes to policy. But that's sort of another overarching one that we didn't write about.
Yeah. Well, Ryan, Alex, keep writing about this. You've helped me understand it so much better. We'll link to both those great pieces in the show notes, and keep up the fabulous work. And thank you for being with us today on Acton Line.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important because it lets us know what topics you are interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Mark Townsend.